The silence in the diner thickened, pressing against Luke's ears. His heartbeat pounded as he set the fork down, his fingers slick with sweat. The man in the far booth didn't move, didn't blink, but Luke could see his throat working as if he wanted to say more. Maggie sighed and leaned on the counter. "You should finish up, hon, it's not polite to waste food." Luke forced a swallow, his mouth suddenly dry. I think I lost my appetite." Her smile remained, but her eyes darkened. "That's a shame." The air shifted. The diner felt smaller somehow, as though the walls had crept closer without him noticing. The overhead lights buzzed louder, the fluorescent glow taking on an unnatural flicker. Then the man in the booth finally moved. He turned his face fully toward Luke, and a cold spike of horror drilled through his chest. His skin was almost translucent, veins visible like an intricate web beneath, and his mouth. His lips were cracked and peeled, but it was his teeth that made Luke's stomach lurch. Jagged. Uneven. As if they had been broken and regrown over and over again. Luke pushed himself up from his seat, ready to bolt, but Maggie's voice came soft and sweet. "If you don't eat, the diner takes something else in return." The words wrapped around him like a noose. A deep, primal instinct screamed at him to run, but his feet refused to move. From the kitchen the sound came again. A slow dragging scrape. A shadow shifted in the doorway. Something stood just beyond the frame, its shape indistinct but unmistakably wrong. A glistening arm, no, a limb stretched unnaturally long, grasped the edge of the doorframe. The fingers, too many to count, twitched and curled against the metal. A single wet breath wheezed from the dark. Luke's breath hitched. "What is that?" Maggie's expression softened, almost pitying. "The ones who stayed too long." His stomach churned violently, a deep ache settling in his gut. His vision blurred for a moment, and in that instant he felt it, something curling inside him, something growing. The man in the booth let out a rattling sigh. "It's already starting?" Luke clutched his stomach, nausea rolling through him in thick waves. Maggie stepped closer, her fingers resting gently on his shoulder. "Finish your plate, hon, it's the only way." Luke's eyes flicked to the half-eaten meal. The once tempting aroma now smelled rancid, metallic. The gravy, thick and dark, had begun to move, pulsing, shifting like something alive beneath the surface. His stomach lurched. The thing in the kitchen took another step closer. Luke had a choice to make. The rain had been relentless for the past hour, drumming against Luke's windshield as he navigated the empty highway. His gas tank teetered near empty, and his stomach had begun to ache with hunger. When he finally spotted a neon sign glowing faintly through the downpour, he sighed in relief. Maggie's Diner, open 24 hours. The place looked like something from a different era. Chrome accents, a checkerboard floor barely visible through the rain-blurred windows, and a flashing "Eat Here" sign that flickered sporadically. Luke pulled into the lot, his tires splashing through puddles. Something about the place made his skin prickle, but exhaustion and hunger outweighed the unease curling in his gut. Inside, the diner was warm, almost unnaturally so. The air smelled of sizzling bacon and fresh coffee, but there was something else beneath it, a scent Luke couldn't quite place, something metallic and heavy. A lone waitress behind the counter, a woman in her late 40s with a kind but tired smile, looked up as the doorbell chimed. "Evening, hon, long night?" she asked, flipping through an old order pad. "Yeah. Long drive," Luke replied, shaking off the dampness and sliding into a red vinyl booth. "You're in luck. We just made a fresh batch of tonight's special." She winked. "House favorite." Luke hesitated, glancing at the chalkboard menu behind her. It was completely blank. "What's the special?" The woman Maggie, he assumed from the diner's name, simply smiled. "Trust me, you'll love it." Something about her tone made him uneasy, but his stomach growled in protest. He nodded. "All right, I'll take it. And a coffee." Maggie disappeared into the kitchen. Luke leaned back, letting his eyes roam the near-empty diner. A single customer sat in the farthest booth, his shoulders hunched over a half-eaten meal. The man's face was obscured by the dim light, but something about the way he sat so still, unmoving, sent a shiver up Luke's spine. The bell above the kitchen door jingled. Maggie returned with a steaming plate of food, thick slices of meat coated in a dark, rich gravy, a side of mashed potatoes that smelled too good to resist. Luke picked up his fork, took a bite, and warmth. It spread through his body instantly, like sinking into a hot bath after hours in the cold. His muscles loosened, his eyelids growing heavier. The taste was unlike anything he had ever had, deep, savory, almost sweet. A strange contentment settled over him, the discomfort of the road vanishing entirely. Maggie watched him closely. "Good, isn't it?" Luke swallowed and nodded. Yeah, really good. The other man in the diner stirred. Luke glanced at him and noticed something odd. His skin was ashen, his eyes sunken deep into their sockets. He looked wrong. The man's lips barely moved as he whispered, "Don't finish it." Luke's fork froze midair. What? Maggie's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes hardened. Eat up, Han, you've got a long drive ahead. The man at the booth shifted, his voice hoarse and cracked. Don't finish. Luke's pulse quickened. A strange pressure built in his chest. His eyes flickered to the plate, then back to Maggie. She was still smiling, but now, it seemed forced. The rain pounded against the windows harder now. The neon sign outside flickered violently, casting strange, warped shadows across the walls. And then, from the kitchen, something moved. A low, wet sound. A gurgle. The unmistakable scrape of something heavy dragging across the tile. Luke's stomach twisted in ways that felt unnatural. He could feel something inside him, shifting, stretching, as if his insides were no longer his own. The nausea clawed at his throat, but something deeper, something far worse, gripped him from within. Maggie tilted her head, watching him with an eerie patience. It's working, Han, you don't have much time. Luke's legs wobbled as he stumbled back, colliding with the edge of the booth. The man who had warned him remained motionless, his eyes locked onto Luke's. There was something in his gaze, pity, fear, and a knowledge that made Luke's skin crawl. What's happening to me? Luke gasped. Maggie sighed, almost disappointed. I told you. You either finish the meal, or the diner takes something else in return. Luke's fingers dug into his gut as a searing pain bloomed from within. He doubled over, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He swore he could hear it now, a wet, slithering sound beneath his skin. Something alive. His vision blurred, the walls of the diner seeming to pulse as if they were breathing. The overhead lights flickered erratically, casting elongated shadows that twisted unnaturally. The thing in the kitchen took another step forward, the sound of its weight against the tiles rang in ways Luke couldn't comprehend. The man in the booth finally spoke again, his voice raw. You need to fight it? Luke clenched his teeth. Fight what? What's happening to me? The man's eyes darkened. The diner, it doesn't just feed people. It feeds on them. Luke's breath hitched. He turned toward Maggie, who only smiled. You should have finished your plate, she murmured. A scream built in Luke's throat, but before he could release it, his stomach convulsed. His knees buckled and he collapsed to the tiled floor. Agony shot through him as his skin rippled, his veins bulging unnaturally beneath the surface. Something was moving inside him. Maggie crouched beside him, brushing a strand of hair from his sweat-slicked forehead. Sure, it's all right, Han, it's just the diner's way of making sure you stay. Luke choked back a cry. I don't want to stay. Maggie's smile never wavered. Then run. Luke's hands pressed against the cool floor as he forced himself upright. Every movement sent another shockwave of pain through his body, but he gritted his teeth and stumbled toward the door. His only thought was escape. Get out. Get away. The neon "Eat Here" sign outside the diner flashed violently, casting blood-red streaks across the rain-soaked pavement. Luke reached for the door, his fingers barely grazing the handle when he heard it. A deep, guttural growl from behind him. He turned. The man in the booth had risen. But he wasn't a man anymore. His body stretched grotesquely, his arms too long, his jaw unhinged wider than any human should. His eyes, once dull and lifeless, now burned with an insatiable hunger. And he was not alone. From the kitchen the thing stepped into the light. Luke's breath caught in his throat. The creature was a nightmare given flesh, an amalgamation of twisted limbs, gaping maws, and countless writhing tendrils. It exuded a thick, pulsing hunger that pressed against Luke's skin like an unbearable weight. Maggie stood between them, her expression serene. You're part of the diner now, Han, you can't leave. Luke's pulse thundered in his ears. The exit was just a few steps away. His legs felt weak, his body failing, but survival screamed in his mind. He had one chance. With a ragged breath he ran. Luke's feet pounded against the checkered tile as he bolted for the door. The diner's neon light flickered wildly, casting warped, shifting shadows that seemed to move on their own. His vision swam, his stomach twisted, but sheer terror pushed him forward. The door wouldn't budge. He yanked at the handle with all his strength, but it was as if the diner itself refused to let him go. His breath came in ragged gasps as he turned, heart hammering. The monstrous figure that had once been the man in the booth was closing in, its grotesque limbs cracking as it took slow, deliberate steps toward him. From the kitchen the thing slithered forward. It moved with an unnatural grace, its mass of writhing limbs pulling it across the floor in unsettling silence. Its gaping maws stretched open, revealing rows of jagged, uneven teeth. The diner's walls seemed to breathe, the air thickening with a deep, nauseating hunger that gnawed at Luke's mind. Maggie remained where she was, her expression unchanged. "It's already inside you, Han, there's nowhere to run." Luke clutched his stomach, another wave of pain ripping through him. His body convulsed violently, his skin burning as if something beneath it was struggling to break free. He dropped to his knees, fingers digging into the tile, his screams swallowed by the pulsing energy that filled the diner. The creatures loomed over him now, their twisted forms radiating an unnatural heat, a pull that sent his senses spiraling. The thing from the kitchen let out a guttural sound, something between a growl and a whisper, as its tendrils stretched toward him. "No," Luke gasped, forcing himself upright. His body screamed in protest, every nerve ablaze, but he refused to surrender. He staggered back, his mind racing. There has to be a way out. The plate. His eyes darted to the booth where he had been sitting. The meal still sat there, untouched except for the few bites he had taken. His head spun as Maggie's words echoed in his mind. "If you don't eat, the diner takes something else in return." Luke stumbled forward, his muscles trembling as he lunged for the plate. Maggie's expression flickered, just for a second. A crack in the facade. It was enough. Luke grabbed the fork with shaking hands and shoved a piece of the tainted meat into his mouth. The taste hit him like a shockwave, salt, metal, something wrong, but he forced himself to chew, his jaw aching, his stomach twisting in protest. The moment he swallowed, the air in the diner shifted. The walls shuddered. The floor trembled beneath him. The creatures let out a distorted wail, their limbs spasming violently as they recoiled. The hunger in the air lessened just slightly, just enough for Luke to move. He didn't hesitate. With the last of his strength, he turned and lunged for the door. This time it gave way. Cold night air hit him like a slap, the rain washing over his burning skin. He stumbled forward, gasping, barely processing the fact that he was outside. The diner's neon lights flickered wildly behind him, the distorted figures still writhing inside. Maggie stood at the entrance, her smile still fixed in place, but her eyes, they burned with something else now. "See you soon, Han," she called softly. The "eat here" sign above her sparked violently, and then darkness. Luke didn't stop running. The diner's neon glow faded behind him, swallowed by the misty, rain-soaked night. His legs burned, his breath came in ragged gasps, but he didn't dare slow down. The cold air stung his skin, but he welcomed it. It meant he was out. He had escaped. Or so he thought. His car was exactly where he had left it, sitting motionless on the deserted roadside. Fumbling, hands trembling, he yanked the door open and collapsed into the driver's seat. The moment he turned the key, the engine roared to life. Relief flooded his chest as he slammed the car into gear and sped off, the dark highway stretching infinitely ahead. He kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see Maggie standing in the road, smiling, waiting. But there was nothing. Only darkness. 20 miles passed. 30. 50. He didn't stop. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, and the familiar hum of the road should have been comforting. But something was wrong. Luke's stomach twisted again. The pain wasn't gone. His fingers gripped the wheel tighter as a deep nausea coiled inside him. A sick, wet slithering sensation under his skin. His knuckles turned white. He swallowed hard, trying to ignore it, to push past it, but then, a whisper. Not from outside. Not from the radio. From inside him. Luke's breath hitched. His stomach lurched, and for a split second he thought he saw something shift beneath his skin. He nearly veered off the road, his vision blurring. The wet squelching sound grew louder, echoing in his skull, in his veins. His insides moved. His fingers trembled as he reached for the dashboard mirror, angling it toward himself. His reflection stared back. And then it smiled. Not him. Something else. The voice slithered through his mind, soft, insidious. "You never really left." Luke's screams were lost in the roar of the open road, swallowed whole by the endless night. The end.